guys, so today I am planning on tanking my viewership again by going through some more poets. So if you didn't see the last video about this, I'm just going through a few old poetry books from a collection called the Canterbury Poets that I picked up in a bookshop in Stirling many years ago, and they were published in the 1800s, and they're a collection of mostly English and British and Scottish poets. We did find Poe amongst there, and he's American, so there's a little deviation, but they're mostly English poets. So in the last video we discovered Owen Meredith, who is the most incredible dark poet that I'd never heard about, and he's really into writing about vampires and really creepy stuff. So if you want to learn about that, check out my previous video. Today we're going to be looking at another 4 poets. We're starting out with James Hogg, and then I'm going to briefly have a little look at Keats, Marlowe, and Edmund Spencer. So starting out with James Hogg. James Hogg is a Scottish poet who was sort of a contemporary of Robert Burns. So if you don't know, Robert Burns, or Rabbie Burns, was the national, or is the national poet of Scotland, celebrated every year in January on Burns Night. And James Hogg came along a little bit later. He came along sort of towards the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, and was hugely influenced by Burns's poetry, which was already kind of superstar status at the time. Now, James Hogg is somebody that I hadn't really heard of before, and so I was flicking through the pages just to see what was in there, and I came across a poem about Stirling. I don't know if that's gonna zoom in, but Stirling Bookshop is where I actually picked up this collection, so that was kind of cool. I was flicking through the pages to see what he'd written, and I came across a poem that I really like called The Old Man's Farewell to His Wee House. So the old man's goodbye or farewell to his small house. But the only problem is that James Hogg wrote a lot in Scots. So if you don't know what Scots is, imagine writing English as you would pronounce it in a thick Scottish dialect. So in Scotland you have Gaelic or Gaelic. I always get confused. I think it's Gaelic in Scotland and Gaelic in Ireland, but correct me because I'm very bad at this. They have Gaelic, which is the Celtic language of Scotland, which is a completely separate language, and then most people speak English. And then you also have this in-between of Scots, which is a very thick Scottish dialect written out as you would pronounce it, so sort of phonetically. And for an English person like myself, it is near impossible to speak it without sounding extremely silly, and there are a lot of words that I don't fully understand. So you can think about it a little bit like Creole. So if you go to West Africa or Sierra Leone and you listen to people speaking Creole, as an English person, when you're listening to it, it sounds like you should be able to understand it because it sounds very familiar to English speakers, but it's really difficult to understand, and there are a lot of words that you can't understand unless you actually know Creole. It's the same with Scots. Unless you actually know Scots and all of the Scots words, it's very difficult to follow along as an English person. So instead of completely butchering this poem, what I've done is I've asked my friend Alan McClure to read it for you. Alan has a lovely YouTube channel called Fae the Shed, where he tells Scottish folk stories from his garden shed. He also has a children's book called Callum and the Mountain, all about spooky adventures in the wee village of Skirrills. You can check those out in the links below. I thought he would be better at this than I would, and my other friend Jan Silver chimed in because she is brilliant in Scots and she's provided sort of a bit of an English translation. So I'll slip that in afterwards. So if, like me, there are a few words that you're struggling with, you can kind of go over the English translation that we've cobbled together and fully understand it. Excuse me, I've got a very creaky chair here at the moment. If you hear funny sounds in the background, it's my creaky chair. So without further ado, here is Alan McClure reading The Old Man's Farewell to His Wee House.
The old man's farewell to his wee hoose. I like your wheel, my wee auld hoose, though laich the was and flat the riggin', though round thy lum the suret grows, and rain-draps gaw my cosy biggin'. Lang hast thou happit mine and me, my heed's grown grey aneath thy kipple, and aye thy ingle cheek was free, baith to the blind man and the cripple. And to the poor forsaken wight, wi' bairnie at her bosom crying, my cot was open day and night, nor wanted bed for sick to lie in. What gart my ewes thrive on the hill, and kept my little store increasing? The rich man never wished me ill, the poor man left me aye his blessing. Troth, though I maun greet with thee to part, though to a better house I'm flitting, sic joys will never glad my heart, as I've had by thy halland sitting. My bonny bairns around me smiled, my sonsy wife sat by me spinning, aye lilting o'er her ditties wild in notes sae artless and sae winning. Our frugal meal was aye a feast, our evening psalm a hymn of joy. Aye calm and peaceful was our rest, our bliss, our love without alloy. I canna help but haud thee dear, my auld storm-battered hamely sheelin', thy sooty lum and kipless clear a better loo than gaudy ceiling. Thy roof will fa', thy rafters start, how damp and cauld thy hearth will be. Ah, sae will soon ilk honest heart, that erst was blithe and bauld in thee. I thocht to cower aneath thy wa' till death had closed my weary een, then left thee for the narrow ha' wi' lowly roof o' sward sae green. Fareweel, my hoose and burnie clear, my bourtree bush and bowsy tree. The wee while I'm on sojourn here, I'll never find a hame like thee.
So yeah, I mean, it's quite rare that I read a poem and I kind of go, choking up levels of oof, ouch. But I thought this was just such a heartfelt, very, very poignant poem. God, I'm feeling a bit teary about it. Goodness, because it's so sad. It's, he's talking about his lovely wife and his children who used to fill the house with with songs, ditties, and and life. And now it seems like he's outlived them all, or his children have left and gone off, his wife perhaps has passed, and he's kind of getting ready to leave himself. And I don't know, it just really kind of, oof. The way he's written it is beautiful. The wee while I mourn sojourn here, I'll never find a hymn like thee. It's kind of saying, in the short time he's got left, he'll never find another house like that, and I think it's the reason it's kind of painful is because we all know what it's like to leave a house, and, especially somewhere that you grew up, or a place that you just really loved living, and you've got so many memories in that place, and then you've got to move on, and it's painful. So yes, I'll include the English translation written up next, and it's not a replacement to this poem because in the old Scots it's much better. It's how it's supposed to be read, but if you're tripping over some of these words, it might provide a little bit of clarity. So yes, I really like James Hogg, and I found he's got a slightly dark side to him, a bit like Owen Meredith, who was a real surprise to me and I loved. And I found one other poem called The Moon Was a-Waning, which is actually written purely in English, so I can read that one. So I'm just going to end up this little segment by reading out The Moon is a-Waning. And I would highly recommend James Hogg. Whether you like Burns or you've never read Burns, check out James Hogg.
The moon was a-waning, the tempest was over. Fair was the maiden, and fond was the lover. But the snow was so deep that his heart it grew weary, and he sunk down to sleep in the moorland so dreary. Soft was the bed she had made for her lover, white were the sheets and embroidered the cover. But his sheets were more white, and his canopy grander, and sounder his sleep where the hill foxes wander. Alas, pretty maiden, what sorrows attend you. I see you sit shivering, with lights at your window. But long may you wait, ere your arms shall enclose him, for still, still he lies, with a wreath on his bosom. How painful the task, the sad tidings to tell you. An orphan you were, ere this misery befell you, and far in yon wild, where the dead tapers hover, so cold, cold and wan, lies the corse of your lover.
Okay, so next up we've got Keats. Now, there are three poets, Keats, Blake and Yeats, who I keep getting really confused. I'm a bit dappy in the head. They've all got 5 letters in their name and the middle one is an A, and so I just kind of, Keats, Blake, Yeats, whatever. I do get them confused, but I really like the poetry of Blake. I do not like the poetry of Keats. I am not a Keats fan. He was a contemporary of Shelley and Byron. Now, we covered Shelley in the previous video, and Shelley is one of my favourite poets of all time, now alongside Owen Meredith, who I've added to that list. And yeah, I just really like Shelley because, as I explained, he just writes beautiful words for no other purpose than writing really beautiful words. And I also really like Byron because I find that Byron, he makes you work a little harder. He's kind of, his use of language is a lot sharper, and there's usually a cutting point to it, or there's an insightful point to it that you sometimes have to work to get there, but working for it is worth it. You know, you get to the end and you're like, oh, damn, that was good, you know? Whereas I'm going to say this, and you know, I feel bad saying it, but Keats I feel was the worst of both worlds. Is he used really complicated language and quite jarring rhythm, I find sometimes, for poems that just don't really have a payoff. That's just my personal opinion and the way that I feel about him, but I feel like he's stylistically, you can feel he's sort of influenced a lot by Shelley. I feel like he does have sort of moments of really beautiful wording, but I just don't feel it flows very easily. So one of my theories as to why he might be like this is because Keats died very young. He was only 25 when he died of tuberculosis. Shelley was 29 when he drowned, and Byron, I think, was around 36 when he died of a disease. I think it was something like typhus in the Greek War of Independence. So they were all very young when they died. The life of a romantic poet was very short. But Keats in particular was extremely short. And I feel when I read his work that if he had lived longer, he might have become better, which is an awful thing to say, but I think, I mean, unbelievably talented for a 25-year-old, unbelievably so. You know, you can see that he is very close to being on a par with Shelley and Byron, but I think if he'd lived just a little bit longer, he might even have surpassed them, who knows, but he didn't. Actually, just looking it up, so Keats died in 1821, Shelley died the following year in 1822, and 2 years later Byron died in 1824, and they were aged 25, 29 and 36 respectively. So not a long-term profession being a romantic poet, but yeah. So I'm actually not going to read from Keats. I mean, like I said, there are some nice moments. So one of his most famous poems is Ode on a Grecian Urn, and the first couplet is pretty. I mean, thou still unvarnished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time. It starts nicely, but then I just feel it gets more and more complicated, as most of his poems do. And like I say, at the end of it, you're kind of left wanting. So I'm actually not going to read Keats. If you want to go and check him out, do. There's plenty of him online. And it's not that he was bad. He was good, but he wasn't as good as Shelley and Byron, in my opinion, and that is only my opinion. All right, guys, so now we're on to the final part of this, which is Marlowe and Spencer. Christopher Marlowe and Edmund Spencer. Now, both of these are from the 1500s, published in the mid-1800s, but they are 1500s poets. So we're talking kind of Elizabethan times. Marlowe was indeed a contemporary of Shakespeare, and I believe he died in a bar brawl. I think that's the only thing I know about Christopher Marlowe's life. So he died in a bar brawl. He was a contemporary of Shakespeare, probably hung out in some of the same establishments, we don't know for sure, but he was also a playwright. And Spencer's an interesting one. So he was Edmund Spencer, and I cannot hear that name, Edmund and 1500s, without thinking about Blackadder. That is an incredibly funny old British comedy. If you've never seen Blackadder, go and watch it, and you will have the theme tune playing in your head every time you hear Edmund associated with the 1500s. And the other interesting thing about Spencer is the Spencer estate is just up the road from where I am now. So I'm currently in Northamptonshire, and the Spencer estate is where Lady Diana Spencer, Princess of Wales, grew up, and that's just down the road in Althorpe. So random coincidences here. Now, I am also going to skip pretty quickly over these two, just because 1500s poetry ain't really my bag. I have to say I appreciate Shakespeare. When I was at drama school, I studied Shakespeare, and I think some of his work is amazing. I will probably take a bullet in the back for saying that my favourite Shakespeare play is probably Titus Andronicus, which is the one that he is absolutely slated for. But you know me, you know my penchant for dark things, baking somebody's children in a pie and serving it up to them, Game of Thrones style. It appeals, you know, what's not to like? Also, if you like old school horror movies, Theatre of Blood starring Vincent Price. Theatre of Blood is a very entertaining old horror movie about a Shakespearean actor who decides to take out his critics, the theatre critics, one by one in a very Shakespearean way. So that's quite good fun. I like Shakespeare, but definitely not the first thing that I would reach for on a shelf. And I feel kind of similarly about Marlowe. So he is a poet, but most of his poetry, apart from a few sonnets, it's plays. There's a lot of plays in here. And the other problem, the problem that I have with 1500s poetry, it can be a little simplistic. So let me just give you an example. This is from The Passionate Shepherd to His Love by Marlowe. And just, you know, see if you can spot what I might take issue with. It's very subtle. And I will make thee beds of roses and 1,000 fragrant posies, a cap of flowers and a kirtle, embroidered all with leaves of myrtle, a gown made of the finest wool, which from our pretty lambs we pull, fair lined slippers for the cold, with buckles of the purest gold. I mean, really? Like roses, posies, kirtle, myrtle, wool, pull, cold, gold? It's not even trying. You know, it's not really trying with that, is he? So, right, I tend to find that a bit with 1500s poetry. It can be a little bit... and yes, I'm also not going to read Spencer because I can't find anything short enough for a video. He is well known for a poem called The Fairy Queen, right? So this is his book, and this is how much of the book is The Fairy Queen. This poem goes on for years. You know, not a bad poem, definitely not a bad poem, but really, really long. What I will do, I want to just pull up on the screen, or read out even, a short piece from his poem The Ruins of Time. Other than being a fantastic title, it highlights something that I do find fascinating about this period, and that is the spelling. So, The Ruins of Time.
It chanced me one day beside the shore of silver streaming Thamesis to be, nigh where the goodly Verlem stood of yore, of which there now remains no memory, nor any little monument to see, by which the traveller that fares that way, this once was she, may warned be to say. There, on the other side, I did behold a woman sitting, sorrowfully wailing, rending her yellow locks like wiry gold, about her shoulders carelessly down trailing, and streams of tears from her fair eyes forth railing. In her right hand a broken rod she held, which towards heaven she seemed on high to weld.
So that is absolutely fascinating. The way that I and E has now changed to Y today. So the spelling of any back then to me looks insane now, because it would be A-N-Y now. And, you know, there are parts of it a bit like Scots, that it's familiar enough that I can follow it, but it's different enough that I trip over it, you know? So it's not immediately easy for me to read. I have to think about it a bit. And it really fascinates me how language spelling or English spelling has evolved to what it is now. And it makes me think, there's this book by David Mitchell called Cloud Atlas, and it was made into a film, which is one of my favourite films of all time. But the book is also very, very interesting, and sometimes for very different ways. And one of the ways is that he writes about the world in like many, 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 many years from now, centuries from now. And the spelling of English words in the book has changed because he assumes that language will continue to evolve. So it hasn't gone from 1500s to today and that's it. It continues to evolve into different spellings and different words later on in time. And I do think that's a possibility. I definitely think it's a possibility that we will change again. But I think it's harder now today because back when Spencer and Marlowe were writing, not so many people were that literate. You know, you had to have a pretty good education to be able to read and write. Whereas today, every book, every newspaper, every website in English uses the same standardized spelling. I mean, there are a few differences between, say, English and American spelling, but it's pretty damn close. And I think that once writing is set in stone as the common language that everybody's using for mass communications worldwide, it becomes a lot harder for that to then continue to evolve into something different, because it takes a huge consensus to agree to change a word, and for that to actually catch on and become established. But yeah, I think it's just amazing. I really like the fact that I have their work for the spelling and to see how language has really changed and evolved. But I wouldn't say that the poetry of that period is my favourite. But anyway, that is our 4 poets for today, and in the next video we shall dive back in with the final 4 from this poetry collection. So I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've learned something, or if you disagree with me on anything, definitely let me know below. And it's wonderful to have these conversations about poets.